Welcome everybody to our panel. We're very super excited to share a little bit about us and more importantly, really shine light on the important issue that we're very, very passionate about and hope to bring the entire audience along as we discuss some of the challenges as well as some of the learnings in both Roshan and Danielle's capacity in the organization that we'll go a little bit deeper shortly. Today's panel is how might we equitably scale affordable housing solutions. My name is Ivy Tang Lei. I am the head of growth at Exergy. I am very, very honored to be sandwiched on my screen between Roshan and Danielle. My role here is a moderator, so really to kind of push the conversation together into a central theme and really hoping that the audience as well are engaged through questions that you can put into your chat that we'll take at the end of this panel. With that, Danielle, would you like to kick off the introduction?
Sure, I'm happy to. Hi, everybody. It's good to see some of you and feel the rest of you. I am joining you from New Orleans. So it's getting later here, but I'm going to keep my energy up. I am head of growth and expansion and a co-founder at the Justice Collective. The Justice Collective is a Black and Asian-owned social impact consultancy based in Oakland, California, but we are geographically distributed across the country. Our work really centers on identifying opportunities for organizations to be more impactful, achieve their missions in the world, and our entry point to that is advancing equity, diversity, and inclusion inside of those organizations. And so my background is in urban planning. I'm a planner by training. I worked in the planning department in San Francisco for a couple of years and started the racial equity work in that department, and then left the city to lean into TJC full time. And in this capacity, have had the opportunity to work with a number of different housing organizations, both city agencies with the Mayor's Office of Housing and Community Development in San Francisco, as well as affordable housing developers like Saha and CDFIs like the Housing Trust. And so this Venn diagram between our communities, historic and persistent inequity, and how we can create innovations that really improve those disparities in our housing ecosystem are really central to my mission, my personal mission in the world. So I'm excited to be sharing the stage with my friends over at Exergy, and I'll hand it over to you, Roshan.
Thanks, Danielle. Hi, everyone. I'm Roshan Sethna. I'm one of the 3 partners here at Exergy. So I focus on all of our civic sector work here. Exergy is partners with social sector organizations to design and build technology that improves lives. So we work a lot with nonprofits, government directly, philanthropy, and we are often their kind of design and technical team. We take a very equity focused lens to our work because we work on a variety of issues such as affordable housing, criminal legal system reform, transit, the environment, things like that. For the past 5 or 6 years or so, we've been building out an open source tool that is an affordable housing platform. So it allows jurisdictions to basically manage their affordable housing stock and deliver it more effectively and equitably. So we've been working with 4 jurisdictions here in the Bay Area to implement that and talking to a bunch across the US to do it as well. My background's in the nonprofit sector. I was a social entrepreneur before this and also was a affordable housing counselor in Houston, Texas, really early on in my career. So housing's sort of been an arc for me. That's it about me. I'll pass it to Ivy.
Thank you so much, Roshan and Danielle, for the introduction. A little sneak peek into how we were kind of thinking about this panel. I think as Roshan, Danielle, and the team was putting together the concept, we really came into a discussion around what equity actually means. in its purest definition. I love to hear from the both of you what that sounds like and what that looks like in your work. How have you seen it actually manifest, and what are some of the things that we can share with our audience?
Danielle, I'll let you go first on that one.
Sure, I'm happy to
Jump
go.
in. Go ahead.
Something that's really interesting when we think about the civic sector and when we think about our government agencies is the shift from this very kind of embedded notion that everyone gets the same is fundamentally contradictory to the notion of equity. So this like equality is the language that is written into our city charters. It was written into our policies and processes. But the reality is that language around equality leaves out the fact that we have a long, extensive history and a number of current conditions across all different contexts that really drive disparate outcomes amongst populations. And so when we consider what is the role of each of us to advance an equity frame, it really requires us to ask the question, what do people need, right? And then meet that need versus everyone gets the same. And so in the work that, that I've done with cities, that like grappling with that, right? Really shifting that, doing the same approach to community engagement is not actually providing equal support and equal access. You have to really shift focusing on the outputs, not just the inputs as we tend to do.
Absolutely. Roshan, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, no, that's a super good point. I think, at least in the US context, it's really easy for us to focus on the individual and like, what can the individual be doing better? Or what can I as an individual be doing better? And I think we just have to look at this as like, what are the containers or the environments we have built that are causing inequity? And in housing, it's decades of discriminatory policies that have like pushed Black and brown people out of certain areas, that discriminate against low income families. So I think understanding how the inequality was created in the first place and the historical context of it is really key to how we actually reverse it, because it's not an individual problem. It's a historical context problem. It's a container problem. It's an environmental problem. And we have created those environments.
Can I add real quick? One of my favorite questions to ask when I'll lead trainings with partners is, if everyone's on camera, how many of you are affected by redlining? Right. And for those of you who hopefully we're all familiar with redlining on this call. But the fact of the matter is that everyone has been affected by redlining, right? It has continued to shape our communities. Our communities have a legacy literally built into the built environment that persists to this day that's influenced by redlining. And so not only are we affected by redlining, not only were many of our grandparents affected by it and our parents, but our offspring, if we choose to have them, will also be affected by it as well if we don't apply an equity frame, right, and fill those gaps.
Danielle, maybe you can actually describe redlining for folks who might not know about it.
Yeah, sure. So redlining is a policy that was put into place and really solidified post-World War II when vets were coming back from the war and the GI Bill was passed. So the GI Bill was passed to allow veterans of World War II to really access a number of social resources and safety nets. And one of the biggest aspects of that was providing access to really low interest rate mortgages. And so redlining was a process of adding a grading system to certain neighborhoods, depending upon the population or the proportion of the population that was Black, transitionary, or white, right? And those ratings then were connected to whether or not you were able to access a mortgage and or how properties were valued in those particular neighborhoods. And so what we saw happen is that the suburbs were actually subsidized, right? So folks at the time, white folks could only white folks could move to the suburbs, and their property value was much higher than the same house would have been in the inner city. And so we still see that persistent residential segregation in most, if not all, major metropolitan areas across the US. Yeah. Thanks for asking.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think so. I currently am located in San Francisco, and it's so clear exactly the types of neighborhoods have been like left behind, and we're seeing changes throughout, even like legislations that are trying to undo some of the harm. But even that, like we're seeing how COVID has inevitably affected specific areas harder than some of the other zip codes. So thanks so much for sharing that. I think the part of what would be really interesting to dig into a little bit is knowing the history and knowing the disparity that exists so vividly in our communities. How do those perspectives get brought to the work that you both do on a day-to-day basis?
I can start with this one. Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly hard as a consulting firm, especially as a design and technology consulting firm coming in to work with government or work with communities. I think like there's inherently a power dynamic, right? When we walk in the room, and there's also a power dynamic that our clients have with the community, meaning government has with the community or a nonprofit might have with the community. And they're paying us, and that, adds to the power dynamic. And so I think one, we have to recognize that. And I know Danielle has always like promoted that, like understanding when you walk into a room, the power dynamic you might have in a certain room might be different in another room. So we try to design our processes to engage people in different ways, and different things I think might work in different situations. The typical process of engaging stakeholders in the community and everyone in digital product creation tends to be interviewing and user testing and things like that. And again, that can be very one directional. You have a designer interviewing someone who might be searching for affordable housing and things like that. So I think you have to find ways to break those molds. I think some of the things we do are, one, we work really closely with community leaders and people who are already in the communities doing that work. They have the trust of the community. So we might, bring in heads of nonprofits and things like that into our process and be way more in touch with them because it's part of their day-to-day, part of their job. Finding ways to compensate. So if we're asking for people's time, we're making sure that we're compensating them for that time. And then being cognizant of who we're asking when. So like when someone's going through an emergency themselves, maybe that's not the right time for them to engage with us. Maybe if someone went through an emergency, was unhoused for a while, has housing now, has that experience, and wants to help, contribute to making the process better for someone else. We've had people help at that stage. And then kind of asking who you're actually making step back to create room for other people. So a lot of times in working with government, you have people that have worked in housing for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. They know a lot about the space. And so we all tend to do this where we're like, we know what the answer is. We know what the problems are. Like, this is the answer. And so we try to initiate a process where it's like, okay, this is our hypothesis and we still need to test it. And maybe I need to step back and see if what I think is actually the right way. So instilling like that mindset and creating that space for other people to fill the space that tends to be filled by subject matter experts, that we tend to be like, oh, you're the expert, you should know everything. But like, what's an expert? Lived experience is also expertise as well.
Yeah,
those are some of the things I'd say, at least from the digital side. I don't know, Danielle, from your end, what you see.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good point of how do we create space for voices and perspectives to be amplified. And a big part of that is how are we defining our stakeholders, right, and our constituents, and then where are we creating multiple entry points for them to engage. And so something that we see happen often in the context of government is that the loudest voices or the most well-connected voices are the folks who can show up at the planning meeting that's happening at 2 p.m. in the afternoon are the ones whose perspectives are then shaping policies, right? And so one of the biggest lessons that I learned when I was working in the city is like what we think is like the baseline for folks to engage. And at the time it was like, you know, make sure folks have sandwiches, whatever, right? Like make sure it's after 5 p.m. and you have sandwiches was like the floor. It was like, you know, like baseline floor stuff. And I remember having a conversation with a health center that was situated in one of the two kind of remaining Black enclaves in San Francisco. So it was in the Fillmore. And it was a health center focused on Black women and infant health. And if you know anything about those disparities, Black women in San Francisco and even more broadly across the country have mortality rates that are like higher than many developing nations, or on par with many developing nations, even if you control by income. So this is like a racialized disparity, not just an income-based disparity. And so this community health center, and you know, me reaching out to them and being like, what does community engagement look like for you all? Like, how do you get the, you know, the mothers that can access your services to like make it all the way here? Because there's the Fillmore, and then there's Bayview Hunters Point, which is the other Black enclave, which is like really far away unless you have a car, right? And even then, it's really far away. And so, you know, for them, they were like, we pick them up, we drop them off, we bring them here, provide them with services, we make sure that someone can watch their kids while we're talking to them about nutrition or whatever they're there for. And then we also give them a Target card, gift card for their time, right? For like, to really help fill the gap of maybe what they could have been doing to earn money in that time frame, right? So maybe they were watching their neighbors' kids and now they have to make choices and trade-offs for that. And so like that list is really long, but it's really important because they understand here are the barriers to folks receiving our services, and they determined ways to fill those barriers. And so the same goes for our housing system and whether or not folks can access resources that are available to them. So really trying to identify like what are the real needs and how do we remove those barriers from those places and spaces.
I think the both of you touch on several very important points. One is like, how do we ensure folks who are already in a very difficult situation are still able to be compensated, whether monetarily or like being very mindful of their schedule and their time to still be at the table when decisions are made. As we all know, the government and the agency only have so much experience or expertise, so to speak, that you know Roshan had referred to when it comes to truly serving the communities in need. And we really saw that come through during the pandemic, and still are seeing that through. In both your roles, you know, whether Danielle in your previous career working with the city, as well as now like being a consultant and really uplifting those gaps, and Roshan in your position as a strategist and a like working on the consulting side for government agencies, what are some common pitfalls that you see, or even mistakes that you see like government agencies making as they are well intended trying to serve the communities that they are looking to serve?
Danielle, you want to go first on this one?
She's like, there's that long list.
It's like, how much time do you have? We all, yeah.
All the things I listed. You know, one of the biggest like double-edged swords of government is its reliance on the written word. And in some ways, the written word is important because it allows us to track what happened, right? It is a way that we capture history and just, you know, step by step a process. It is a way that we transmit information. It is a way that we like intend to ensure everyone's like on the same page. Even that phrase, on the same page, is a reference to the written word. But the flip side to that is that it leaves out, especially when in government we do not have solid coverage around language access, right? San Francisco does a really good job of this in some ways, but in other places and processes has huge gaps, right? So folks that English is not their first language. We have folks who are illiterate, right? Or functionally illiterate. We have folks who are blind, right? Or vision impaired and unable to see or read in that way. And so not only that reliance on the written word as like the entry point to accessing resources, but also even the language that's used via the written word, right? I was filling out an RFP earlier and I'm reading this thing and I'm like, I have 3 graduate degrees and I do not know what any of this means. Like, I don't even know what to put on this form right now. It's absurd, right? And so to think that a mom and pop, you know, vendor, for example, or someone who's looking for housing assistance can navigate these complex systems. That in and of itself is one of the biggest challenges with government, is like that challenge of like, we have to have the written word in some ways, but in other ways, the primacy of it, the only entry point of that, really misses out on huge populations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Roshan, if it's okay, before you jump in, I want to make sure something that like Danielle has said during one of our discussion that I really want to quote her on is that how do we bring people closest to the pain closer to the power? And that just like resonates so well in what we're trying to kind of allude here. And I want to make sure that the audience here got to hear that. Roshan, please.
Yeah, I love that phrase. We learned so much from Danielle.
All the time.
I was gonna, Danielle, we definitely run into that in our work too. And I think when we are using written word, I think we make sure we're assessing reading level as well, and just understanding like the words we're using, the amount of text and things like that. Yeah, I think the list is just so long with public sector services. Other than what I kind of mentioned already in terms of people who've been in the sector thinking that we might already know the solutions. I think a lot of bigger institutions make this mistake. Any institution, I think, makes this mistake, and government does it a ton, is kind of centering the organization and the department and the agency instead of the end user. So as the Department of blah, 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 Department of Housing at XYZ, like, we need people to know that we exist and our brand and like what our services are. And like, in reality, an individual just doesn't really care. They're just like, yeah, some of my services might come from here, might come from here, and I'm just trying to find them and access them. So that's the first one I'd say, is like, there's a lot, especially if we're using San Francisco as an example. It's a very federated city. So each department and agency is very separate. They have their own brand, their kind of logo and things like that. And what San Francisco is trying to do now is unify and say, like, let's bring everything in one place and just say it's housing services. And you don't have to go to the homelessness department or the mayor's office of housing and the veterans department, all these different places to find the services. And then the second thing I'll say is, I think we have a structure that puts the burden of accessing services on individuals. So that's a norm in the US, that we have a form, you go to the DMV, you apply for something, you get it, and it's always on us to fill out that form and access it. And I really think we need to shift that burden to government and just like delivering services. And we're starting to see some of those trends federally with the child care tax credit and things. Like, how can that just like go through a department and get out to people who we already know are eligible? Why do people need to apply for it? Or Code for America is doing this work around record clearance. If someone exits a criminal legal system, can we automatically clear their record if it's XYZ type of crime? Why do they have to know that they need to clear their record and apply for that clearance and things like that? So I think we need to do a lot of shifting of the burden of that from people back to government.
Yeah. One of XG's close friend and advisor, Vu Bang, will always talk about how folks who are applying to a $6,000 apartment has this like easy access, like luxurious, like journey into finding their apartment. And someone who is looking for affordable housing deserve the same humanity and the same assistance because we all deserve to be housed. And it's this like onus that is always on those who are most marginalized to speak up, like to do the work, to like find the housing application, to fill it out perfectly when it's not created with them sometimes in mind. It's really, like Roshan said, unfortunately centering the folks who have been in the department but not necessarily have actually gone through the journey of looking for housing themselves.
Yeah, and I think we don't really. Oh, sorry, Danielle. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, this is again one of those areas where like historic context is really important for us to consider, right? So when we think about like why these systems were put in place, like the spirit of government, like that many folks who get into government believe and embody is really about like service, right? And many of the structures and systems that persist even now were intentionally meant to gatekeep and exclude, right? And now they do it in a race neutral way, if we were thinking racial equity as an example, right? But the same requirements or the bar being raised, that was never corrected for. It was never course corrected. And so this notion of like, how can government actually bridge towards people, not people, have to fill that gap that they didn't create, that they in fact oftentimes are born into, right? I really love that reframing of like, let's just get the resources to the people if that's the point.
Yeah, like we created the system whereby people have to find all the resources. Why did we do that? But to your point, there's historical context there. I was going to say something related to, just
the 6,000.
Well, the added cost. Yeah, I mean, our advisor Rubang's point. I mean, there's so many things that we know take a lot of time, right? Like all of us do take a lot of time doing our taxes, for example. But if we're wealthier, we can pay someone to do that and outsource it. And there are, like, I think as across class, there's just a drastically different burden in terms of what it takes to access services. And you just have to spend way more time, whether it's filling out forms or waiting in line or things like that to get basic services when you're a low income family. And if, to Vu Bang's point, in San Francisco, where you're paying like $6,000 a month in rent for an apartment, and you applied for that on Zillow in like 10 seconds and, you're able to get it, there's way fewer barriers that you're crossing. And so I think we have to add up all the different social services that people might need to access and understand like the barrier of time is really huge. If you're talking about just housing, it's one thing, but if you're talking about food, if you're talking about transit, like every piece kind of adds up, and that's a huge time burden across class.
That's actually a great transition to the next question. As we've seen technology and awareness around racial inequities becoming more and more of a both a tool and an important piece of consideration when we're making, whether that's like design decisions or policy decisions, we often see the evolution of policies being created by a bunch of people, then they get executed, and then they then get like delegated. And through that journey, there are unintended flaws and consequences that create or perpetuate further inequities. Sometimes they get it right, but like even with that comes like collateral damages. And oftentimes those are folks who don't have the time to raise their hands and be like, we can't, like, this is not okay. What are some examples of that happening? And have are there examples that you've worked on that you could use to kind of illustrate some of those dire consequences.
I'm happy to start. I mean, one of the reasons that happens is because we have kind of bias built in along the way, right? And by bias, I mean like people who are executing and making decisions all along the way. And so when we think about policy being created, where, like I was saying before, the loudest voices are the ones that are shaping the policy, then that policy gets, maybe like iterated a little bit, and then it has to be implemented, and then it's implemented, right? And then it's delegated to an individual. And so there's something here about how do you ensure that the individuals and the collective kind of bodies along the way are as representative of the end user as possible. So that both matters on the kind of the tech side of it, right? So the kind of company side, but it also matters when we think about government. And so the importance of both representation of folks who, again, are the end user, but also a deep investment in the knowledge and skill of everyone to be able to identify where those potential pain points are. And so the more, again, that, and I keep going back to it, that we can ground ourselves in a historic and current context and conditions that are shaping these outcomes, the better, if you slow down, you're able to say, ooh, wait, hold on, I actually think this doesn't go far enough. Or are we considering an impact that we may not have otherwise considered? And so it requires this, representation, investing in people's skill and capacity, and a pace that allows you to be thoughtful and intentional about how you build and execute the thing. And people don't like to slow down, but it's actually really critical to be effective in implementing equities to like slow down, right?
Yeah. I think sometimes governments are slow for other reasons. But
It's true. It's true. No,
but
it's true. Like I'm telling
sometimes,
government to
yeah,
slow down, but
yeah,
I'm telling government to slow down when politics is the driver over everything
right,
else, right?
right.
Like things move really quickly when a decision maker says prioritize this, right? But then we have other aspects of bureaucracy that slow things down. And so it's in
Yep,
relationship, but if we're not
yep.
asking the right questions at very specific junctures, we miss opportunities to improve.
Yeah, for sure. It's like slowing down for the right reasons, not because like that's just the way it's always been. Roshan?
Yeah, the policy thing is, I mean, I find it like super fascinating. I think I think in the equity space, we always talk about intent versus impact. You might have had a certain intention, but the impact was different. I think that's the same thing with policy. Like you might be crafting this policy and you think it's going to help, these types of families not get displaced or whatever. And then the impact might be different. And so here's where I think some design and technology skills can be applied to policy. We talk about this concept of like agile policy making or iterative policy making. So is anyone actually measuring the impact of a policy and shifting that policy if the intended impact is not happening? I don't think our lawmaking system was really set up that way, but I think I've actually heard of some examples locally of like agile policy making at the like city municipal level. So I think it's starting to become a little bit more of a popular concept. But so for example, in San Francisco and a lot of cities across the US have this where it's called an inclusionary policy. So it essentially means that any new construction in the city, a percentage of those housing units have to be rented out below market rate. So you might have a new building that there are some $6,000 a month units, but a percentage of those units have to be rented out at below market rate. But that was when we were talking to people getting those units, it was just interesting because they were like, yeah, we don't really fit in this neighborhood. People kind of exclude us. There's also not, we don't have grocery stores and other things accessible that are also affordable. So it's just really hard to live in this
Right.
neighborhood. So yes, theoretically, great, we have more units that are, renting out below market rate, but what is the actual impact on the ground? Another example of this is in the housing application process. A lot of housing developers were asking for social security number. And when we redesigned that process, we were really questioning, like, okay, what all is really needed for people to apply for affordable housing? Why is social security number needed? And we asked that a bunch of times in different sessions, and basically came to an understanding with different housing developers that mostly people were using it as a unique identifier to say, okay, this is this person's application. And we're like, okay, great. There are a lot of other ways we can uniquely identify someone. Like we can use name and birth date, and flag when there's some duplicates for someone to review. But we don't want to unintentionally create a database of people that have and don't have social security numbers. Like we should think about the negative externalities that could come out of doing that. So it's about kind of like proactively thinking about negative externalities on policy or design, proactively, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
When you all told me, I was just going to say, when you all told me that story, the important context is that you were asking these questions when Trump had just taken office, right? There's a.
We were asking them during the Obama administration. He had not been elected.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. But point being is like the conversation around immigration, right? And like the broader context of what those pressures are and what populations are currently kind of under attack, that is important for folks making decisions along the way to understand as well, right? It's doesn't exist in a vacuum, is my point.
100%. Like we didn't anticipate what happened when Trump first took office, with a bunch of resurgence around xenophobia and all that stuff, because the election hadn't happened when we were designing this stuff. So I think it's like it's so hard to be a designer, but it's like so critical to ask these questions of ourselves, because we don't know the impact that something could have down the road if we don't ask them upfront.
Yeah. I think the important point is like xenophobia didn't exist just because of the last administration. And it's like when we make decisions around policy and technology, it's like we have to prove it enough that like no matter who takes it, the next administration and administration after, that the community that we want to serve will not become a list to go down. And I think like New York City went through that when Trump got elected, and it's like, oh, you didn't think about, how by separating people with municipal IDs, and like folks who are like without documents and like with documents, and how that could be used and used as a weapon. We can't guarantee what's going to, knock on wood, like we just elected a Democratic president, but like xenophobia existed way before that. White supremacy existed way before that. So like, how do we protect and actively ask those questions, like you said, Danielle, so that those considerations are brought up in every aspect of those design. I like to complicate that a little more. I think oftentimes in America, there's also always this like zero sum game. Like by giving marginalized communities the things that they need for basic humanity in an equitable way, it's taking away from others. And there's this idea between the wealthy and the not, the white and the not. And as someone who's Asian American, I think there's also always like this idea around, oh, if like this group gets this, then like this other group will then like not get it. And it's like we're fighting for this like same slice of pie, when in reality, check out all the other slices these like other people have like held on to for decades. How are those like consideration being brought into discussions as you're working with some of the clients?
Yeah, I mean, the pie metaphor is really right. So instead of thinking about slices of pie and divvying up them even smaller and smaller, it's like, how can we grow the pie, right, to fit even more folks inside of it? And one of the things that's been really kind of critical and important to hammer home across all sectors in all fields of focus is that when we generate solutions that fill gaps for the most marginalized of us, then other people and other groups end up benefiting. And I'll give you a really concrete example, and it's also really relevant to kind of our national dialogue around police brutality. So one of the policies that folks who are uplifting the struggle for, to end police brutality in the Black community, or against Black folks, right? Lift up is we really want police to be trained to de-escalate conflict, right? So if they're pulling someone over, we want police to be equipped to de-escalate the conflict, right? That is a policy recommendation that folks who are advocating for more just criminal justice system talk about. Who else might that benefit, right? Other than Black folks, right, who are being unarmed Black folks who are being murdered by police. That's going to benefit people who English is not their first language. That's going to benefit people who are hard of hearing, right? That's going to benefit people who have maybe either a mental health issue or are experiencing a crisis, or maybe in some ways neuroatypical, right? And so thinking about a solution like that, while the origins of it are meant to fill a very clear and stark disparity around police brutality, there are other groups that would benefit from police being equipped to de-escalate conflict, right? And so we can apply that same thinking to all other areas. When we fill those gaps for the most marginalized, we create conditions where everybody really wins and ends up benefiting in the long run.
Yeah, I think
that message needs to be like pounded somewhere, like plastered on a shirt, campaign, like for sure. Roshan, go ahead.
Yeah, and taking it back to your point too, Ivy, about xenophobia existed long before Trump, and it's going to exist long after Trump. I mean, we are designing within all of these systems: racism, sexism, xenophobia, all of them. I think I talked to friends of mine about like how, universal programs like Medicare for All and things like that will benefit everyone. And yet, I think we still have to make sure we're designing them in a way that they get to everyone equally. But I think we can take a little bit of this lens, like of what are basic needs that everyone needs met, and like how do these solutions impact multiple groups, because they do, and none of us live in this like I am just a woman, or I am just an Indian American, or I am all those things. And I think one thing you could say, maybe if we've talked about a lot about Republicans, but I think the Democratic side can tend to play a lot into identity politics, and sometimes that's good. We do need to understand that different groups get impacted by things differently, but also we need to go after universal programs that benefit everyone as well.
One of the panels that we recently hosted at Code for America, Anton Robinson from the Innocence Project had said, we can't talk about today's race, like injustice, without reckoning with the racial past of America and racial like founding of America and the racial like start and all of those things. And it's incredible piece of what may not be like an automatic association when we talk about design decisions or policy decisions, but like I'm really, I think, hopeful that as we are having this conversation, that like the ripple effects of that being considered will somehow make it into boardrooms and somehow make it into policies. We have about 10 minutes left. There are questions that Adriana and June from our team has consolidated. Michelle Klein asked, in the situation where a policy has a certain intention with an unintended impact, what is the step here? Is there a way to test, quote unquote, certain programs for a short period of time to a smaller population, similar to the way products are beta tested before full rollout.
I mean,
Dun,
this
dun,
is my
dun.
dream. Like, this is like what I talk about all the time. Ivy can attest to that. I don't know if like policymakers have this, you know, process down at all. I think I talk about this at every chance I can get so that it becomes more of a thing. Code for America folks talk about this a lot, but I think there's an ability to start to put clauses into policy to say, hey, let's track these metrics. Let's check in a year. Let's see where they're at and let's iterate on the policy. We haven't seen that a ton yet, but like I mentioned, I've heard it kind of whispered at the municipal level in California a bit. And then, oh my gosh, I blanked. I was going to say something else. I can't remember what I was going to say. Danielle, go ahead. I'll remember.
One thing I'll just kind of layer on top, well, maybe two things. So one thing is we tend not to look back and reflect on how things went. And so one of the best ways that, you know, you don't even have to have like a super formal process. You just need to normalize reflection and introspection. So when we're thinking about how a community engagement process went, just like pausing and saying like, what are the plus deltas of this? Like what went well, what would we change? Who did we miss, right? You can do that in both the micro and the macro context. What I'll also say is that when it comes to addressing disparities, our timelines also have to be different, right? So we are filling gaps that, to Rose's point, are not only decades, they're like centuries in the making. And so this notion that even in a small pilot period of time, we're going to see the sorts of gains that we would hope for, the gap completely filled, is actually probably not the case. And so what we do find tends to happen is like folks will try it for a period of time and then they'll be like, it didn't work, let's like try the next thing, right? Instead of pausing and saying, but what do we want to retain from this, right? And incorporate that into next time. And so not doing, and folks who are funders, because I know some of you are funders on this call, that's really important for philanthropy to hear too, right? Because oftentimes philanthropic focus and cycle, you know, is like 5 years or 3 years or 10 years or whatever, which can sometimes is often not long enough to really see the sorts of gains and change that you would like to see. And then you're asking nonprofits to pivot and do something different, right? And so really adjusting our time horizon and managing our expectations around impact is critical.
I remembered what I was going to say.
Thank you, Danielle. Oh, sorry.
Oh, no. Yeah, I think also the way policy is created can be just all over the place. Like a lot of times, like private sector organizations will write policy for policymakers. Like it's not always created in the most sound way. So I think we need to figure out, first of all, who's actually writing the policy. And then second of all, written policy is also different. Like people need to then interpret it. And I think it can be often interpreted in a bunch of different ways. So I think there is, Michelle, to your question, like some wiggle room in the interpretation of a policy to say, hey, let's shift something if we learn that it's not having the intended impact. And you could probably shift something still within the confines of the written policy. And then the third thing is, I think there is a trend towards just more observation and data and tracking and even qualitative tracking. To Danielle, your point about these are long arc changes, and the best we can do is understand, like, okay, what is being influenced now, what is being influenced next year, how did a pandemic affect it, you know, and really just tracking and understanding how things are shifting to better inform the policy change.
Yeah, to the follow-up around like what's preventing that testing and reflection, I think one, we tend not to have a culture of like reflection and introspection. That's one piece of it. Two, we are constantly under pressure to shift focus, and that really prevents us from being thoughtful and iterative over time. And this is one of the places where TJC works across all sectors intentionally because there are things to learn across all sectors. And so government has its way the tech sector has its way, the nonprofit sector has its way, but there's not enough cross-pollination. And so this is why I love when Exegy is working with government partners, because they're able to bring design thinking to historically and really presently contexts that are lacking oftentimes that design thinking, right? And that agility for a whole host of reasons. And so there's a bit of a culture shift that has to happen. And that plays out not only on like at the individual and kind of team level and even agency level, but like, how can we ensure that our resource allocation is reflective of building in those places and spaces to really iterate on things, right? The like, get it in by this date because that's what the policy says, instead of saying, what's the outcome that we want to drive towards? And then work back from there to determine how much time it'll take you to get to that outcome. That's a really key shift that has to come both from the top, but also has to be executed and implemented at the individual level.
It kind of relates to what Michelle's latest question is about, what's preventing that program testing. Thanks, Michael. And reflection. I mean, it is a mindset, to your point, Danielle, and kind of the skill set. I think it's also just a lot of government partners tell me this. It's like they don't get rewarded for trying something new. And they don't get penalized for sticking with the status quo, even if the status quo is not great. But they will definitely get penalized if they try something new and it's worse, or it doesn't work out. And so that's a lot of the retraining we do, Danielle, a retraining we do, and just saying like, what are the small ways? Like if you've never engaged with end users, how about just talk to 3? Just start talking to a few, because that's better than talking to none. So we start to like shift the culture in very, very small ways.
Yeah. I'm sure we can all talk all day about this if everybody in the audience wants to stay all day on Zoom. If it's okay with Danielle and Roshan, we're going to share your contact information in the chat box, and then folks can keep in touch with you all through your website, on LinkedIn, certainly through Exegy's Twitter, and as well as the Justice Collective Twitter and social media handles. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining this discussion. We know it's a work in progress, and we're so, so happy that you were able to join us today. Have a great rest of your week.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Megan. Oh, Canada.
When this is the what is it? The elevator?
Just wait.
It doesn't really work on my desk. All right, bye, y'all.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thanks.